Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the God's Plan for History teaching series. This is our talk number 6, which will be about the kingdoms in the book of Daniel. And Daniel's a pretty amazing book. The prophet Daniel was either given visions or interpreted visions that others had, such as Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. But these visions that are throughout the book of Daniel really tell the future for the world and the major kingdoms that are going to arise all the way from the 6th century BC when Babylon was on the scene as the basically lead nation in the world, all the way up until the return of Christ and when he sets up his millennial reign from Jerusalem and reigns over the world for 1,000 years. So the book of Daniel has all of that and every kingdom in between. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Mainly three different chapters where there's three different visions of different kingdoms, and I'll talk about how they're represented as we go. But really, it's in three different places. The first is in Daniel chapter 2, and then we'll move to Daniel chapter 7, and then following that, Daniel chapter 8. That's where the three visions are that Daniel either interpreted for Nebuchadnezzar or received himself. There is a pattern to these visions and in these kingdoms that they represent. So in Daniel 2, you'll see four kingdoms that are predicted to rise, with Babylon being the first. And then you'll see after that Antichrist kingdom mentioned, and then Christ's kingdom coming at the end to really destroy all other all others who want to usurp the throne of Christ. He's going to be King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and he will reign over the entire earth after Antichrist. So then you have Daniel 7, where instead of four, you now have three kingdoms mentioned, and then Antichrist, and then Christ again. And then in Daniel 8, you have one less kingdom again. So you have two kingdoms mentioned there, and then Antichrist, and then Christ coming back. So we're going to start in Daniel chapter 2, talk about these four kingdoms first, and then kind of move through that, and then we'll see where it takes us today. So in Daniel chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar, he had a dream, and he couldn't remember his dream, and so he asked all the soothsayers and all the wise men of Babylon to tell him what dream he had, and then tell him the interpretation. So they all told him, well, nobody knows what dream you had, but Daniel, he was a young Hebrew man that had been taken from Judah, captive in Babylon, and then he was in around the king's court and heard this request from the king, and he prayed, and God gave him the interpretation for Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So God actually told Daniel what the dream was, and then told him also the interpretation, so he could relay that to Nebuchadnezzar. So the first thing is Nebuchadnezzar was told that the reminder of his dream. So his dream was he saw an image with a golden head. It had breast and arms of silver. It had a belly and thighs of brass. And then it had legs of iron, and then feet, which were part iron and part clay. And then it had 10 toes, also part iron, part clay. And then the king saw a stone that was cut without hands, and that stone smote the image on the feet and broke them in pieces. And then the whole image comes crashing down because Christ will, as I said, he will be King of Kings, Lord of Lords. So Daniel reveals that the metals in this statue, this image that Nebuchadnezzar saw, they represent kingdoms which shall arise. And then he goes to tell Nebuchadnezzar that he's the gold part. So we know right off the bat that Babylon and King Nebuchadnezzar, they're the head of gold in this image. And that probably caused a little bit of pride, and actually a lot of bit of pride in Nebuchadnezzar, because he goes on after this vision is explained to him, and basically builds, an image to himself at gold and wants everybody to worship it. So, I'm not sure that's the desired effect there. that Nebuchadnezzar should have. But he actually ends up a humbled man, through a series of events which are described in Daniel, and he actually does give glory to God. Um, After his sanity is restored, it's taken from him at one point because of his pride, but then it's restored to him, and then he worships God and acknowledges God as the one, who allows kingdoms to rise and also puts them down. So, but we go on there, and one thing to remember about interpreting visions in the Bible is it's always really good to start with, does the Bible tell us exactly what this vision means, somewhere around the passage. So you look in Daniel first and you see, is there anything that would tell me directly what, like for instance, the silver breasts and arms represent? What's the next kingdom? And so we're actually given that information in Daniel 5:28. You go a little bit further in Daniel, and you'll find out that the kingdoms which will arise after the Babylonian kingdom was the Medo-Persian kingdom. And that's actually what we know from history also. So we can be sure from the Bible and also from just knowing history that the silver breast and arms are actually represent the Medo-Persian kingdom, with Darius and also Cyrus, the Persian, as the heads of that kingdom. Um, and then we learn a little bit later in the Bible, we can actually know the third kingdom, which is the belly and thighs of brass, which is the Greek kingdom or the Grecian kingdom. And their first great king was Alexander the Great. Um, so the brass belly, and we're told that, again in Daniel 8, that after the Medo-Persians actually predicts that the Greeks will conquer the Medo-Persians, and it doesn't mention Alexander by name. Actually, he's the one king who's really not mentioned by name of these different empires. Everybody else at least has a name associated with their most prominent, but Alexander is not mentioned. He's just mentioned as a description of him, but not mentioned by name. So the brass belly and thighs represent the Greek kingdom. Actually, and we know from history, Alexander did defeat the Medo-Persians in 331 BC at the Battle of Arbela. So we know from history and also from the Bible that the brass thighs and belly are the Greek kingdom. Now, the next kingdom that's mentioned in the Bible is not mentioned in Daniel. It's described in Daniel, but not mentioned by name. So would be the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire came to power, and it actually is the next great kingdom that's mentioned in the Bible, but it's not mentioned again until you get to the New Testament. In fact, Luke 2 actually begins with Caesar Augustus. He's the emperor of Rome, and he's making a decree that the whole world should be taxed. So we know that the legs of iron are Rome. And Rome actually did conquer Greece. Many people, historians, would mark the year 146 BC as the year that Rome conquered Greece and became the world power. Some would put it all the way to when Rome didn't actually conquer the Egyptian part of Greece until I think it was 31 BC. So, but most people consider 146 BC the year that the Romans took over first place in the world as far as world empires go, and they really were the world empire for quite a while. So then you move to the feet and the 10 toes of iron and clay. So we know that the feet and the toes are an extension of the Roman Empire, but now you have the iron mixed with clay. And I think what that means is that Rome would go from political Rome and then have a mixture with either papal or religious Rome. So what we see right now, even today, is you have religious Rome, which is still a empire across the world, really. In Roman Catholicism, its reaches are across the world right now, and so Rome, I believe here, the clay is to really predict political Rome becoming religious Rome. And Revelation 17 actually lets us know that the 10 toes are 10 kings which shall rule for a short while during the tribulation with Antichrist during the Great Tribulation there. So Those 10 kings, those are represented by the 10 toes, and they come up right at the end of the tribulation period as 10 kings to rule with Antichrist. And then the stone, which destroys all other kingdoms, that is Christ. Christ is known as the rock. So he's the stone here. He's the cornerstone of the church. And he's the God of heaven, which will come down at his second coming. And then he will set up his 1,000-year reign, and where he'll reign from Jerusalem with a rod of iron across all the nations. And that's when the earth will be at rest, and Israel will be the head and not the tail anymore. And they will be at rest also as God's people. So now we go to Daniel chapter 7. And Daniel 7, as I mentioned, has the same pattern, except one less kingdom. And then instead of using metals, God is going to use a description of different beasts to represent these three kingdoms, which he says are going to arise. Now, you'll see in some commentaries and some study Bibles that some Bible theologians try to match these kingdoms with the kingdoms of the image in Daniel chapter 2. So, some people would say the first kingdom is Babylon again, and then Persia, and then Greece. However, if we look at Daniel chapter 7, verse 17, and we see the important word shall, which is future, meaning future, the time that Daniel received this vision was actually given in verse 1, which was the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. That's probably Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, who's reigning over Babylon. And at the time of the handwriting on the wall, that's when the Medo-Persians actually take Babylon. But we know that these kingdoms have to come after Babylon because of the word shall. They haven't arisen yet. And so we know in the short term, they could represent Persia, Medo-Persia, and then Greece, and then Rome. And then you go to Antichrist and the return of Christ in that succession of kingdoms. But I believe, as we'll look more into this, it also has, it has a near fulfillment with those three kingdoms, and then you'll have parallel kingdoms which will arise later on, and I'm going to go over what those kingdoms are. So we have a far fulfillment also of this prophecy. The far prophetic fulfillment are really empires that run parallel to the Medo-Persian, the Greeks, and the Romans. And I'll show you what I mean by that here in a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the interpretation of what these different beasts represent, and then I'll go back and give an explanation of why I believe that's true. So the first beast is described in Daniel chapter 7, verse 4. And it's a lion with eagle's wings, which is also known as a griffin. Well, the griffin is the symbol of Great Britain. I believe that this beast described in Daniel chapter 7, verse 4, it represents Great Britain. When you look at the wings that have been plucked, like you think about the American Revolution, you think about, they've lost quite a bit of their worldwide kingdom as different parts of that have declared their own independence, like India, that whole area there of the world was under Great Britain's occupation, but now they're free as well. So I believe when it talks about a man's heart being given to it, that they used to have a vibrant Christianity in Great Britain, and now it's more humanism. I think that's what it represents. Also, Great Britain is very similar to Persia in that there are two countries, two empires, and only two, which have sent the Jews back to the Promised Land. So the Jews were returned after the Babylonian captivity by the Medo-Persians, sent them back into the Promised Land so they could resettle there. That's the first time they were sent back. And then they weren't sent back again really until 1918. Great Britain sent them back under the Balfour Declaration. So Great Britain and Persia are similar in that they're the two nations of the world that have sent the Jewish people back to the Promised Land. Great Britain really became a world superpower when they defeated Napoleon's army back in 1850. And that's really when they started as the world superpower. The second beast in this far fulfillment of Daniel chapter 7, that's described in Daniel chapter 7, verse 5. And it's a bear that's raised up on one side with three ribs in its mouth. So the bear, I believe, is the Russian bear, or the Soviet Union as it was known in the past. The three ribs are nations which the Russian winter, sometimes people call it General Winter, the Russian winter actually destroyed three different kingdoms or kings or emperors, however you want to call them, and those people were Charles the 12th of Sweden, and then it was probably somebody you'll know better than Charles the 12th. Not many people are familiar with him, but actually the Russian winter destroyed his army, and then Napoleon's army coming out of France, the Russian winter destroyed them. And then what ultimately destroyed Hitler's army out of Germany was the Russian winter. And that's how Hitler really was, on the losing end, is that the Russian winter basically destroyed the German troops. So that's what the three ribs are in the bear's, that the bear has there. It's really incredible to contemplate how much flesh really that bear has devoured over the years. And then Russia is also parallel to Greece. So it would be the second of these three beasts mentioned. Russia actually gets its language from Greece. And so they're very similar to the Greeks. Also, USSR, when they became the world superpower, was probably 1945, where right after World War II, they had the world's largest land power. And the Soviet Union really lasted until 1991 when it was dissolved. Some people would put it a little earlier, back in 1988, when the Berlin Wall came down as the fall of the Soviet Union. But nevertheless, it was a world superpower and is represented by the second beast in Daniel 7:5. And then there were three superpowers really that came out of World War II. There were three after 1945. So the first was Great Britain, and they lasted until the Suez problem, where they really lost their world superpower status in 1951. And so after then the Russians are still in power, but also the United States is the third superpower after 1945. The third beast that's described in Daniel chapter 7, verse 6, it's the leopard with four wings and four heads. And this beast does represent the United States. So one of the things about the leopard is it really represents ethnicities. So you think about a leopard. A leopard is a yellow animal with black spots and a white belly. If you go all the way back to Noah, he had three sons. So there was Shem, there was Ham, and there was Japheth. And you go back to the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10, and you'll see the descendants that are described. There's actually 70 different nations described in Genesis chapter 10, and they are all descendants of these three sons of Noah. So Shem, he's really the Asian people. You'll see that, and by Asia I mean Middle Easterners, and also all the way out to India. And then you see Ham is the father of the African nations. And then you also see Japheth, he's the father of the European nations. So Japheth, if you want to talk ethnicity or skin color, Japheth is white. Ham is black, and then the Asians are under the yellow part of the leopard from Shem. Now there is a fourth group there that's actually almost their own group. That's the Canaanites. They actually come from Ham. Canaan's one of the sons of Ham, but they spread out across the world, and they're probably the peoples that settled many areas like South America, because one of the descendants of Canaan was Sidon, which the Phoenician Empire came from him. And the Phoenicians were the great sea kings, which basically, I believe, settled a good bit of the world just by taking people by boat. I think South America probably was settled in that way. And also, I believe, also a group coming out of Canaan, the Sinites or Sinites, depending on how you pronounce it, they actually go to China, and that's who the ancestors of China are. So the Chinese are actually descendants of Canaan, and the Far Eastern peoples that keep moving east and probably even walk across the land bridge at the Bering Strait are Chinese people who keep moving east. So all that to say is this third beast is basically when it talks about a leopard there, it's a multicultural animal. And so we know that the United States right now is the great melting pot. It's the multicultural country, where all kinds of people, every different skin color, every different ethnicity are welcome here. And, we basically have been known for that as a country since our founding. So that's what the leopard represents. Now, it says that this leopard has 4 heads, and I believe that represents the balance of our government. So you have the Senate, you have the House of Representatives, you have the executive branch, and you have the courts. So you have a 4-headed federal government in our, for our nation, and I believe those 4 heads actually represent the balance of power for our government. The other thing is it has here are 4 wings. So I believe these are states which are not part of the continental U.S. We have 2 of those wings right now. We have Alaska and we have Hawaii, which gives us 50 states. I believe we still got 2 to go. So I believe state number 51 will either be Puerto Rico, because to get balance in the wings, you need a southeastern state, new one, which is not attached to our continental U.S., and you also need a northeastern one. So Puerto Rico makes the most sense right now to be the southeastern one. And also, if you look at a map, a world map, you would see that the mass of Greenland actually, matches well with Alaska. And so my best guess here is that we will have 2 more states before Christ returns, probably one right before the rapture, and then one other one during the tribulation to get to 52. And we will have our 4 wings. So that's something to look forward to for our country. 2 more states and 2 more wings. Also, just to remember that when I talked a little bit about the number 51, which is 3 times 17 in a few talks ago, that that's associated with the rapture throughout the Bible. And that's why I say probably the next state will happen right before the rapture of the church. And then we will have the number 52, remember I said was associated, which is 4 times 13, associated with Antichrist kingdom. So I believe we'll have our 52nd state during the tribulation period, and that will wrap it up for the United States as the world superpower here. And then Daniel 7 takes the same pattern, predicts Antichrist kingdom, which the 4th kingdom of Daniel 7 describes, and then Christ's kingdom comes after that again. There's also for these 3 kingdoms, so we have basically already stated Great Britain, Russia, and the United States. They also have a spiritual aspect to them. Remember I said back in our talk about numbers again, the number 3 is usually spiritual kingdoms, and I think these 3 kingdoms also represent the 3 branches of Christianity. So you have Protestantism, you have the Orthodox branch, and then you also have the Roman branch of the Roman Catholic branch of the Christian church. So you have 3 parts to the Christian church right now. So you would have Great Britain representing the Protestant part, you would have Russia representing the Orthodox part, and you would have the United States representing the Roman part. And I think the church will begin to return back to Rome, and I think the United States will probably be a leader in that effort as we get ready for the tribulation to come. So that's how also I believe that these three kingdoms are important because remember I said the number seven, so this is Daniel chapter 7. When we see seven in the Bible, we should be thinking about the church or at least the completion of things. So I think this again would point us to the church. And then there's one more reason I believe that these three kingdoms should be identified in the time period that they are, is because remember I said at our second talk when I talked about the key words in the Genesis 1 account of creation, that on the sixth day, which represents, points to the sixth 1,000 year period of history, the key word there was beast. You saw that if you listen to my second talk, that the key word there for that sixth day is beast. And you see that this word, you have a direct cross reference to these visions. And I think we should put them in the sixth of the 1,000 years or the period we're in right now, as far as kingdoms. So these are all the reasons that I would identify these kingdoms, these three beasts in Daniel chapter 7 as Great Britain, Russia, and the United States. So we have one last group of kingdoms, which it talks about, and this is Daniel chapter 8, and also goes along with it, talk more in detail in Daniel chapter 11. So it actually tells us what these two kingdoms, what the vision represents. We don't have to wonder. Daniel 8, chapter 20 and verse 21 actually identifies who the two visions represent. And that's the Medo-Persian Empire and the Greek Empire. And gives us some details. And I think because it's also in Daniel chapter 8 after chapter 7, I believe this is also has a far prophetic fulfillment. And you'll see some allusions to the Antichrist in Daniel chapter 8, mentioned as a little horn, and also Daniel chapter 11. So it has a near fulfillment in that it's going to tell you what's going to happen between these two empires, how Alexander comes along and he actually destroys the Medo-Persian Empire. And then when Alexander dies, his kingdom is actually split up into four different groups. And it was split up into Greece, Syria, Egypt, and then Asia Minor, which is also modern day Turkey. So these four kingdoms are again described in Daniel 11. And so you have the same pattern, but now you have two kingdoms, and then you have Antichrist mentioned, and then Christ again will come to reign over all. So we should expect for our future, for the tribulation period, two kingdoms to arise after the United States. The first one I would say, Persia's, the Persians right now are the country of Iran. So Babylon would be Iraq, that's today's Iraq. But Persia, the Persian Empire, is actually modern day Iran. And so I think this is predicting that the world's next superpower after the rapture would be the nation of Iran rising to prominence. And then also some part of the Greek Empire, probably Turkey, because it actually mentions Pergamos, a city in modern day Turkey, Asia Minor, being the seat of the Antichrist, or the seed of Satan, as it actually says in Revelation chapter 2, verse 13. So, that gives us a hint that probably the Antichrist will come out of where modern day Turkey is. That's one option. I'll probably mention more as we get into our talks later on. But Daniel 8 and 11 are very, very interesting in that, this vision is given in the 6th century BC, and it talks in detail about how all these very specific things that are going to happen as you move from the Medo-Persian Empire to the Greek Empire. Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 are the only place in the Bible I know, I'm aware of, which talk about the period in between the two testaments. So the Old Testament ends with the book of Malachi, and then God, as far as speaking through prophets, is actually silent for 400 years until John the Baptist comes on the scene right before Christ starts his ministry. So between Malachi and John the Baptist, God is really silent from heaven. But the Jewish people are still living their lives. they were under Greek occupation, and actually Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 talk about this guy who comes to power. His name was Antiochus Epiphanes. That's what he called himself, Antiochus the god. So the Jewish people called him Antiochus Epimanes, which is Antiochus the madman. But he's a guy who basically desolated the temple inner sanctuary, by sacrificing a pig and then also choking down pork down all the priests' throats. So, and then really just spilling all kinds of blood there. So that desolation of abomination, a type of what Antichrist is going to do happened, in the 2nd century BC, led by this guy who came from one of Alexander's 4 generals. So, after that, the Romans kind of take power, and so then you move into the New Testament. But Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 really talk about very specific things that are going to happen, and actually did happen, predicted 100% accurately in that period between the 2 testaments. So all that to mention is that, I hope that you get out of this study today that God knows the end from the beginning, that he's not surprised, and he hasn't lost control. And we would do well to trust him in all things, and also pay attention to what he predicts for the future. And we're going to keep on talking about that. So next week we'll talk about the church and God's prophetic passages for the church, and we'll see what God still has plans for his Christian church right now. And then we'll see the plans for the tribulation, and then we'll see the plans for Christ coming back. So with that, we're out of time today, and I hope this was very instructive for you. Thank you.